Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Olaf Ragnar Grimsson, former President of Iceland and Chairman of the Board of Arctic Circle, Your Excellency, Mr. Gudni Thoralisius Johannesson, President of Iceland, Your Excellency, Mr. Sigurdur Ingi Johannesson, Prime Minister of Iceland. Let me attempt another person. Your Excellency, Ms. Lilja Dögg Alfredsdóttir, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Iceland, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, it's a great honor for me to be given this recognition by the Arctic Council. Thank you, Mr. President, for your consideration and recognizing the work of the United Nations. It's not only me, it's not only whole staff who have been working hard day and night during the last 10 years, but there are many government officials, leaders, and business community leaders, and civil society leaders who should be recognized, who should be given this prize together with me. Today, I humbly accept this recognition, this prize, on behalf of tens of thousands of such dedicated leaders. It's not only government leaders, so many business community leaders, and so many civil society, NGO leaders who have been fighting and raising their voices. And I deeply appreciate all those people who have been marching along the street around the world, who have been working with the United Nations. And I represent only some a small segment of that effort. I am deeply honored, Excellencies. Now, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be back in Iceland for a second time. 3 years ago, I had the pleasure of visiting the Hellisheidi power plant and saw the way Iceland is taking full advantage of its remarkable geothermal resources. I also visited Langjökull Glacier and saw the impacts of climate change. I went there with then Environment Minister, now Prime Minister, together in a helicopter. We were trying to find out where this helicopter should land. It was very difficult to find some place where helicopter could safely land because it was either melting or there are so many difficult situations. I saw all these dropping water drops, melting water drops from the edges of these glaciers. Was not looking serious. When I went down, when these melting waters from the ice glaciers were gathering and powering and falling from the falls, the sound was thunderous sound, roaring. So small water, dropping water became fall, and I was so much frightened. All this quickly changing and quickly receding glaciers. I sent out, of course, a strong message standing from there, and that helped to raise awareness and urgency, sense of urgency of people, and I deeply appreciate for that opportunity. That's why I'm here the second time, as we are just waiting for this climate change agreement enter into force on November 4th. It's now crucially important that this document, this paper, intention of the commitment by the world leaders be transferred, translated into actual action on the ground. I count on your strong support. We see progress and peril in close proximity. I have yet to visit the Blue Lagoon, but will experience that Icelandic wonder tomorrow on my way to the airport. I'm also pleased to be back in Arctic region, although I know we are a few degrees south of the circle. In 2009, and again last year, I went to Svalbard and beyond, and spent some time with the scientists from all over the world who are doing pioneering research about our changing environment. In 2014, I visited Greenland and spoke with those whose traditional way of life are being threatened to change. So I'm very glad to be with you today for this important assembly. And I'm very much grateful and for your strong continuing commitment through this very important gathering. We meet indeed at a momentous time. As I said, we have just crossed over this threshold. We have, as of today, 75 countries who have ratified this Paris Agreement. It's a record-breaking speed, a record-breaking number, which we have been establishing in the history of the United Nations. When world leaders came to the United Nations on April 22nd this year, that happened to be a World Mother Earth Day. 175 state parties signed this Paris Agreement. That was the record breaking. We have established a new record. The previous record, which has been existing 34 years, was the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was signed by 119 countries in Montego Bay, Jamaica in 1982. That has been the world record, that any agreement, any treaty or convention was signed in one place in one day. In one place in one day at the United Nations headquarters, 175 signed. Now, as of today, 191 state parties are signed. Altogether, we have 197. With 75 countries ratified, with 59% of total global greenhouse gas emissions accounted for, and this Paris Agreement on climate change will become legally effective on November 4th. But I'm urging those countries who have not yet ratified, please do so. It's important that the more universal nature of this agreement, the better, the quicker we'll be able to implement what have been agreed. In fact, few expected that this will happen. What once seemed to be almost impossible, now it has become unstoppable, inevitable, irreversible. This is what we are now experiencing. Political leaders and scientists and citizens in the streets all played a role in grasping the gravity of this threat and mobilizing to set the world on a safer and more sensible path. I'm also heartened by the agreement 2 days ago by the members of the International Civil Aviation Organization, what is known as ICAO, in Montreal, agreed on a new global market-based measures to curb CO2 emissions from international aviation. This is an important first step by governments, industry, and civil society, and builds on the strong momentum emanating from Paris for multilateral action to reduce the risks of climate change. So let's hope that we will be flying airplanes with reducing much less greenhouse gas emissions starting from 2020. I have been planting trees, or I have been paying some money for all travels which I have been emitting greenhouse gas emissions. I was not all, but I was one of many passengers, but I was required to do so as a way to show my strong commitment. These breakthroughs come not a moment too soon. We are all keenly aware. The Arctic is melting before our eyes. There is a steep decline in ice sea. On one single day last month, the Arctic ice cap melted at 3 times its normal rate, losing ice the size of England. Can you believe? In just 3 days, we are losing the size of England, the melting size. Permafrost is thawing, releasing carbon and methane into the atmosphere. The Alaskan and Canadian glaciers are retreating. Changing seasons, irregular weather, all this and more is happening and deepening. The Arctic supports key pillars of the climate system regionally and globally. The fate of the Arctic is tied to the fate of Miami, Mumbai, Shanghai, and the coastal cities across the world, and so much else, of course. When the Arctic suffers, the world feels the pain. And when the planet is under assault, the Arctic is likewise a casualty. The Arctic is ground zero for climate change. Scientists tell us it is warming more quickly than the rest of the planet. A warming of the planet by 2 degrees Celsius, the upper limit of what the Paris Agreement calls for, could mean a change of 4 and even 5 degrees in the Arctic. Scientists, the most pessimistic estimate, are being overtaken by events on the ground. Now we must turn, as I said, our words into deeds and implement this Paris Agreement on climate change. We need financial resources to help developing countries in reducing their emissions and adapting to inevitable climate impact. $100 billion, which have been promised in 2009 in Copenhagen, must be realized so that developing countries can receive this fund. We need governments to reach consensus next week in Kigali, in Rwanda, on a critically important amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which will phase down hydrofluorocarbons. This could help prevent up to half a degree of warming by the end of the century. Our target, as you are well aware, 2 degrees, but we strive as much as we can to reduce, contain to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The world must also reduce other short-lived climate pollutants, including black carbon, which contributes to the rapid warming of snow and ice. And we need more investment in the opportunities side of the equation, in more renewable energy and in innovative technologies. This is what can accelerate the coming transition. Scientific research will continue to be crucially important. I'm encouraged to know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, will issue a special report on the oceans and cryosphere. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what happens in the Arctic affects us all. But let us remember those on the front lines, the many indigenous peoples who have lived here for centuries. They contribute to the Arctic's diversity and sustainable resource management. Yet, as with the developing countries, those who have contributed least to climate change are being hit first and hardest by serious consequences for their safety, health, and human rights. Indigenous peoples are also affected by national strategies for climate change adaptation and mitigation, especially renewable energy initiatives such as windmill farms and hydropower projects, which often take place on indigenous peoples' territories. This has created tensions and brought displacement and dispossession. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is our inspiration for how to recognize and respect indigenous peoples through our actions and initiatives. Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge of living in harmony with the nature and their contributions are essential to help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and combat climate change. We have often seen that many industrialists or government industrial policies in the name of economic development has been fighting against the nature. But indigenous people, they have centuries-old wisdom to live harmoniously with the nature. That we have to learn those wisdoms from them. I urge you to ensure that indigenous peoples, their rights, and their social cultural contributions remain central as we address these shared challenges. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is a critical moment for the Arctic vision. You are wrestling with the implications of increased tourism, expanded shipping, management of your fisheries, and competition for oil and gas resources. The well-being of Arctic societies is at stake. As we address competing claims and reconcile the varying visions for the region, let us be guided by the actions required by the Paris Agreement, by the 17 goals of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and by the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, partnership for the common good and protection of our common home. I have often said that we do not have Plan B because we do not have Planet B. So we are living only in one planet. These Sustainable Development Goals, climate change agreement are meant for people, planet, peace and prosperity through partnership. Let's forge such a strong partnership and let's resolve our commitment again today as we are about to see the entry into force of climate change agreement to make this world healthier, more prosperous and harmonious, and living harmoniously with the nature. That's our wisdom, that's our guideline, and let's work together to make this world better. Thank you very much for this recognition. Thank you very much.